Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen. Nabiyyina Muhammad bin Abdullah wa ala alihi tahirin wa sahbihi ajma'in wa ala man qama bi da'wati tawhid ila yawmiddin wa ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I would like first to thank my dear brother, Dr. Harvey, for extending this invitation to me to come and benefit from the scholars and students at this college, and also to share with you some of the things I come across in my own readings. And also to thank the founders of this college. I know both of them. I met them a few years ago and a few times. And it is I've always told people that this is one of the best examples of what can be done in developing centers of learning in the UK. And very often when people ask me, where are the examples of UK graduates who can do something to contribute to Britain, I always mention the existing Darul Ulooms in the UK, and also centers like this which are trying to find a path between that tradition we have inherited in the Darul Uloom system and also the academic system. And this is really very, very important. One of my teachers and colleague, Dr. Jabal Bouaben, who's now based in Brunei, he once said something. He said, when it comes to institutions, you find that you often have an institute, educational institute, where they have the right vision, but lacking resources. And then you may find other institutes where they have all the resources, but lacking the right vision. And he gave examples of that, across the Muslim world. And then it is very rare that you find institutes where you have both the vision and the resources. Often institutions with the right vision lack those resources. So we make dua that Allah will continue to bless institutions like this so that they can do more than what they are already doing. Right. And I would like to discuss my paper is on the Majālis. And any discussion on Majālis really is about education. It is about places like this one here, about places like Ebrahim College. They are in a long line of institutions which have gone before. So why do we need to talk about classical Majālis? They are construction sites of knowledge. You get to see, when you study Majālis literature in particular, you get to see the ingredients that go into the production of knowledge. Before ideas were refined, processed, and packaged into the volumes that we now see. So in the study of what was happening in the Majālis, you get to see these ideas as they are developing. Often what we do today, we go into a library, we pick up a volume, and we are reading the processed material. It's like going into a shop, you buy something, you don't understand how that has been produced. But Majālis literature gives us the information of how these ideas were being developed. Often, when they are now edited volumes done by students loyal to the teacher, a lot of material is left out because it is deemed to be embarrassing to the teacher sometimes by the students. The discussion that happened in that Majālis, where maybe the teacher was questioned or challenged by other rival teachers, that often is not found in the products of the Majālis, in the final version of the works that we inherited. That's why Majālis literature is important. And it also gives us confidence as students that when we ask questions, present questions to our teachers, we are doing exactly what others before us did. And that it is important to have that diversity of view. So the Majālis classical Majālis were characterized by a cross-pollination of ideas. you had the exchange of ideas between scholars, grammarians, mufassirin, and so forth, and also characterized by multi-disciplinarism and interdisciplinarism. You had poets studying alongside fuqaha, you had mufassirin, the lughawiyin, and so forth and so on. They were all studying together, as you will see in when you read Majālis literature. So what is Majālis literature? Majālis literature are records of what transpired in the gathering. For example, we came here and I was offered juice and things like that. Those details will be there in the Majālis literature. So it's not just about the lecture itself, what I spoke about, but everything else that happened. And those details are often very important, but those details don't make it into the final volumes when the works have been written and compiled. So the questions that are asked, the scholars and researchers here may ask me some questions. They may challenge some of the positions I will present. Now, if I'd come with my own students from Cambridge, for example, while they are recording this conversation, they would leave out some of the things they consider to be embarrassing. So when they go and compile those notes into volumes, you don't find that information. And yet, what has been excluded could be actually very important, could enrich our understanding of how the ideas of the scholar are developing. Right. So they were also characterized by diversity. Diversity in terms of ethnic diversity, also cultural and intellectual diversity. So why is this important? Because often people on the margins, they see with a third eye. They see things that the dominant groups take for granted. For example, a woman in a male-dominated intellectual space will be able to ask questions that I, as a man, will not be able to ask or will not even think of asking, because she's looking at things from a completely different perspective from me. And those questions are important. They enrich the intellectual tradition. So when you have intellectual spaces, schools or colleges or universities where you only have the same kind of people from the same background, the same intellectual, ethnic, and cultural background, then it is because the students are suffering. The students will be suffering in those spaces. Some of you here have attended, those who have gone to university, some who went to, even those who have been to seminaries will know that in almost often people have a stereotypical view of Islamic seminaries, that all the teachers agreed on everything, they all, even when they've all subscribed to the same tradition, whether it's Diobandi tradition or whatever it is, they all agreed on everything. I went to a seminary. When we were doing Dawratul Hadith, we would come from the class of Tirmidhi and going next door to the class on Sunan Abi Dawud, getting completely the opposite of what we had just studied and being told that's not how you look at this tradition. It's the wrong way of looking at this tradition. And by the same different teachers. So the advantage of having that diversity is extremely important because students are exposed to this. And we enjoyed that because we would move from one class, whether it is Al-Bukhari, and then you go to Sahih Muslim, and these are teachers who often don't see eye to eye in terms of ideas, and they're giving you different perspectives to the same text. And different approaches, so it enriches the students' development and knowledge. So you know that there are many ways of looking at a tradition, and there are many ways of interpreting texts. You don't just leave the college or the seminar or the university thinking that, well, that's the only way of looking at this. That's why, and often, as we will show in my discussion, this idea of bringing scholars from different parts of the world, people who think differently, started as early as the 9th century. Even from the second half of the 8th century up to the 9th century. So it's not something new. It's not something that developed recently. It started very early. So early Muslims realized that the idea of rihla, that you have to go and travel and study hadith with a scholar, is important, but maybe it's not the best way of acquiring knowledge, because how many lives do we have, right? And they didn't have the traveling took years. So you would go and spend many years with one scholar of hadith, and by the time you want to go and study fiqh, you're too old to do anything. Or maybe the great scholar of fiqh has died. So, you lose out, or you'll find that maybe the scholar of grammar is not available. Or maybe as a student also, you don't actually know who is the best teacher. You'll only go to the famous one, and very often the celebrity teachers it doesn't necessarily mean that when someone is famous, is a celebrity preacher or teacher, they are good teachers, right? So you will just go with the flow because that's where your friends are going. You go and study under maybe teachers who are not that good. But when they started bringing them, and this is happening in the Abbāsids, we will see, they start bringing all these different scholars from Khurasan in particular to Iraq and under the same roof. And then opening up the doors to people to come and study, you start to see the development of the various sciences that we are studying today. And people were coming into the masjid. You could study on one corner fiqh, on the next corner there is hadith going on, and there is poetry on the other corner under the same roof. So that diversity was important. And also this diversity we see even in the early development of the ulum. Take, for example, the Makkan Majālis, which became known as the Makkan schools of tafsir. Right, the founders of these schools, you had Sa'id bin Jubair, then you had Mujahid bin Jabr, then you had Akrimah, and then you had Tawus, and then you had the famous Ata ibn Abi Rabah, who is described as Sayyid Tabi'in, Ilman wa Amalan. Right, and all of them, they were Mawali. All of them were Mawali, right? And three of them were, three of them were of African origin, and then one of them was Persian, Taus, but what they were all Mawali. It means they were outsiders, outside of the structures of power in ancient Arabia at that time. They had to, for their own protection, they had to link themselves to the prominent families. Mawalis were not slaves, although some of them were slaves. Often people fail to make a distinction between slaves and Mawali. So they were members of the Mawali community who were sort of marginalized communities. And they dedicated their time to the study, and they became the founders of one of the three important schools of tafsir. Right, the Makkan school of tafsir. So, and Ata ibn Abi Rabah today would not get a job even in some of the Islamic colleges and in the Islamic school. He would not get a job. Imam Ahmad said of Ata ibn Abi Rabah that if knowledge was given to people on the basis of their looks, Ata would not be deserving of it. Right. And he was cross-eyed, impaired, he had severe disabilities, and he became blind towards the end of his life. And physically, by the standards of the day, he was not considered a handsome person. He was considered ugly physically. And he didn't have, according to the biographers, in his majlis, he didn't have more than 10 students. And today, with the celebrity culture, you have people with millions of followers. If Ata had a Twitter account, he only had maybe 10 people, on his Twitter account. But these were quality. He had Abu Hanifa on his Twitter account. He had all these great muhaddithin who were following him with his students, right? So people like Abu Hanifa didn't look at how Ata, they didn't think that Ata, I can't study with this person because he's not, they didn't think about that. And so you see the fruits of his knowledge in his students. Right. Today, the Hanafis are so proud that their teacher, the founder, studied under Ata and Ikrimah. Right. These were two of the, of course, the many great scholars from the Makkan school. Right. Among other many scholars, and Abu Hanifa got his ijaza from one of them, the license to practice fiqh. He got it from one of these scholars, right? So that diversity is extremely, extremely important, right? So any discussion on classical majalis, it is important because they were intellectual and literary spaces in which both a shared memory about the past and also new forms of knowledge were produced and disseminated. So my talk will draw from some of the Majālis literature that is already available. Majālis al-Udaba, Majālis al-Ulama. This is very, you find a lot of interesting stuff in these works. So, so although these Majālis of knowledge became a common feature, Majālis of knowledge, the Majālis of poetry and other cultural activities, although they became a common feature of early Abbāsid intellectual life from the 9th century onwards, their origin can be traced back to the Jāhilī period. We often think of the period of Jahiliyyah as a period in which there was no knowledge at all. I mean, we know that's not the case. So they can be traced back to that period. The famous literary critic Ibn Rashiq al-Qayrawani wrote in his Al-Umda that whenever a new poem was composed by a famed poet, the Jahili tribes would gather to hear it being recited in a majlis. If it was a qasidat on madah, if it was a panegyric, they would often prepare a celebratory feast as though they were celebrating a wedding, and then they would congratulate the mamduh, the object of the qasida. So why would they do this? Because, as you know, Al-Jahid writes in Kitab al-Hayawan in volume 1 that the poetry was the Diwanul Arab. It was the archive. It was the archive of their knowledge, of their ulum, of all the things they treasured. The akhlaq, their moral and ethical teachings were preserved and disseminated through poetry. It was easy to remember, so it's easy to pass on to children. So it was important. So things like muru'a, shuja'a, al-jud, generosity, al-hamasa, and al-hilm with a ha, all these were important moral and ethical teachings which were valued by pre-Islamic Arabs. And Islam came to endorse and to endorse all of the pre-Islamic moral and ethical teachings except for one, the cult of revenge. So everything else, every other moral and ethical teaching which was the basis of Jahili society was adopted by Islam and became part of Islamic moral and ethical teaching. So when we look at these things today, we study them in hadith, we think, okay, maybe they were just introduced by the Prophet. But no, Ibn Qutayba writes in Kitab al-Arab, in the opening chapters, he discusses this, that all these things we often take for granted today as Islamic teachings were in fact inherited from the Jahili Arabs, except for one, the cult of revenge. You know, in Jahiliyyah, they could go on for centuries killing each other over a cup of coffee, right? So this cult of revenge is the only aspect of pre-Islamic moral and ethical teachings that Islam did not embrace, although we do study it today in the Hamas of Abu Tamam, for example, for educational purpose. It was adapted and some of its more negative elements removed, but everything else, Al-Hilm, Risalat fil-Hilm, and you find in that Risala fil-Hilm the riwayat where the ulama of the 9th century onwards, saying that we were instructed to study hilm just as we would study fiqh. That we were told that we must master hilm and fiqh. If you were a faqih who didn't have hilm, you were not a faqih at all, right? So there's a lot of discussion on that. Kitab al-Bayan of al-Jahid, and also I think almost every writing from the early period has chapters and chapters or discussions or scattered through which cover this aspect of Jahili. So this was important. It was these teachings which were documented in the poetry, and it is for this reason that the pre-Islamic Arabs placed great emphasis on the importance of poetry, and this really carried on even in the time of the Prophet. The Majālis for the performance and the study of poetry continued into the time of the Prophet, from the Jāhilī period up to the time of the Prophet. There are numerous traditions, in fact, chapters dedicated to this. In Sunan Tirmidhi, there's a chapter on poetry. In Sunan Tirmidhi, in Sunan Abi Dawud, there's a chapter on poetry, and read that chapter today, you'll see references to the Majālis of poetry. In one of the tradition, Tirmidhi says, حدثنا علي بن حجر قال حدثنا شريك عن ابن حرب عن جابر. Right, the tradition is from Jabir, who says, جالست النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أكثر من 100 مرة, that I sat in the Majlis of the Prophet for more than 100 times, and his companions يتناشدون الشعر ويتذاكرون أشياء من أمر الجاهلية, that they would sit there, recite poetry to each other, and the translation is, I attended the assemblies of the Prophet of God more than 100 times, wherein the companions would recite poetry, yatanashadun, and relate yatadhakarun, stories from the period of Jahiliyyah, while, and this is the part, and the part that is وَهُوَ سَاكِتٌ وَرُبَّمَا تَبَسَّمَ مَعَهُمْ, and while he was sitting quietly or silently watching them, and sometimes he would laugh with them. So the Rawi inserts this information for the reason that you all know, right? The definition of Sunnah. So At-Tirmidhi goes on to classify this hadith as Hasanun Sahih, and the verbs, as you know, yatanashadun, yatadhakarun, used in the tradition indicate that the Sahaba would take turns to recite and relate and memorize the poems and the stories. So these assemblies functioned as informal or formal, depending on your definition of schools, for the memorization of the past, the Jahili poetry, and the knowledge of the akhlaq of the people of Jahiliyyah, things like al-jud, generosity, because these things, anyone who studied Jahili poetry know that these are the central themes in Jahili poetry: generosity, shuja'a, al-jud, and al-hilm, and so forth and so on. The same thing, things that we value today as Muslims, the generosity that we practice, they are the central themes of Jahili poetry. When you read the poems, that's the main focus of this, and that's why they were so important, even for the Sahaba to be educated in this, in the presence of the Prophet. And so younger companions like Aisha, Ibn Abbas, and Ali, and others were educated in these schools, and we have, for example, a tradition that Aisha was often heard reciting verses from the poems of Labid bin Rabi'a. He was her favorite poet. She would often recite many of the poems by Labid bin Rabi'a. And Aisha's student, Urwa bin Zubair, narrates, he was heard declaring that I have never met anyone on the face of the planet who had more knowledge of poetry and law than Aisha. Right? So the Majālis were also diverse in terms of gender. Right? So Aisha would go on to have her own Majālis, her own gatherings where she taught her own students. So Aisha, according to her students, was the most knowledgeable of her generation in poetry and law and fiqh. And in the tradition that is you find in Tirmidhi, when the narrator states that the Prophet listened silently and he smiled or would laugh with them, Jabir bin Samra wants to show that the Prophet endorsed these majalis for the performance of poetry in the masjid. The point is underscored in a version of the same tradition recorded by the eminent traditionist Ibn Abi Shayba in Kitab al-Adab under the chapter Babu Istima' Nabi Ash-Shi'r wa Ghayru Dhalik, in which the narrator states that the Prophet never stopped them. Sometimes he would just smile. Right. Another version of the same tradition in Imam Nasa'i's Sunan, in his and also in Imam Muslim's Sahih, in that version, it suggests that these gatherings were well attended because they were, they were held after Fajr prayers, when everyone was there. So the timing of the majlis was important because the Prophet wanted everyone who could attend to benefit from these majalis. So they were, it's not like today when people miss Fajr, but the people then, Fajr was the time when many people attended, because it was the weather and everything was conducive. So according to a tradition in Abi Dawood and also in Imam Tirmidhi's collection narrated on the authority of Aisha radiallahu anha, the Prophet used to set up a mimbar in his masjid for Hassan bin Thabit, who would stand on it satirizing those who spoke against the Prophet. So the Prophet, with his own hands, placed a mimbar in the masjid where the poets would stand and do their job. Right. So, and this is the end of the quote. And the Prophet himself was fascinated by Jāhilī poetry and by the poets. And according to a tradition recorded by Imam Muslim and by Ibn Abi Shayba, the Prophet would often request some of his Sahaba to recite his favorite Jāhilī poems while he listened. So he didn't just sit in these gatherings smiling, and because he loved to listen to what was being discussed. And he once kept on requesting from a Sahaba to recite verses from poetry, and whenever the Sahaba stopped, the Prophet would carry on, give me more, until the Sahaba had recited over 100 verses in one sitting. So this was really regarded as an important sunnah of the Prophet. So the majalis continued even after the death of the Prophet. Kathir bin Aflah, a tabi'i and a student of Zayd bin Thabit, who is the brother of Hassan bin Thabit, recorded that the last majlis, and he says, and I quote, "The last majlis I attended with Zayd bin Thabit was the majlis in which we all recited poetry to each other." Right. And Abu Khalid al-Walibi, another tabi'i from Kufa, describes how the Prophet's companions continued with the tradition of holding majalis for discussion about Jahiliyyah, about the poetry and language. And he says, "I used to attend the assemblies of the Sahaba in which they would mention nothing else apart from poetry and the Jahiliyyah until they disperse." Right. So this does not suggest that they didn't have majalis on hadith and so forth. They had these majalis. But the majalis of poetry was regarded as an important part of their education, although they were secular majalis, because this was Jāhilī poetry. It wasn't religious poetry, apart from what Hassan bin Thabit recited. But these secular sciences, if you like, were given a platform in the masjid. They were considered to be an important part in the formation of every young Muslim. So they were given the same place as the religious sciences. The Prophet didn't separate between, he didn't say this is Jāhilī poetry. Those of you who know, for example, the poem Banat Su'ad, the original Qasida to Burda, not the other one that's so famous, you see it on every wall, the original one. And it was recited in the presence of the Prophet, and he loved it. And you should read it, the style of it. It's not very different from the Jāhilī Qasida in terms of the language, the style, and even the imageries, and later scholars were debating. Of course, not later. In our modern times, some scholars are debating whether some of the description you have in that poem the poet is describing a woman or a camel. Suyuti didn't have a problem with that. Suyuti and other early scholars, they say, well, this is the Jāhilī description of the form of a woman. It was as metaphors then, and there is no reason why we can't accept that the Prophet said and listen to that. So the Jāhilī poems were like that. When you read them, you see there are references to Khamr in Jāhilī poems. There are references to the love of the poet towards a woman, the opening of the Qasida, as you know, the references to the Dar, كيف نبكي من ذكر حبيبي ومنزلي the manzil and هل غادر الشعراء under the opening, there's references to the dar, the abode, lost love, and so forth and so on. And these were the poems that they were reciting and discussing in the presence of the Prophet. So they were secular in that sense, but they also drew upon from these poems what we now consider to be religious teachings, things that we often think of the moral teachings of Islam, and so forth and so on. So Umar, in the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, Umar tried to impose a ban on these majalis, and he suggested that they should not be happening in the masjid. He would create a space somewhere outside where people could do that. And of course, as you can imagine, he encountered fierce opposition from Hassan bin Thabit and others. And Hassan was angry, and he said to Umar, I used to perform poetry inside this very masjid in the presence of one who is better than you. So who are you to stop us from doing this? So Umar was forced to withdraw that proposal. Right. So they carried on up to the Umayyad period. In the time of Muawiyah, as you know, the Umayyads were antiquarian. They loved the past, and they were obsessed with the past, and they carried on with these traditions where, especially in Muawiyah's, in fact, a lot of the traditions we have on these things like Muru'ah, Hilm, and come from the Umayyad gatherings, Majalis. He was somehow, for some reason, he was passionate about this topic of Hilm and generosity and so forth, and in his gatherings, these were some of the central themes. When you read the Majalis from the Umayyad, where Muawiyah is present, you'll find a lot of them cover these subjects like al-Jud, al-Najda, and Hamasa, and so forth and so on. He's asking for definitions, and he was considered to be a scholar on these subjects. So when you read the riwayat on Hilm, you find a lot of these riwayats lead to Muawiyah. So he was a scholar on these, and I think that has to do with the fact that he promoted these discussions in his time for various political reasons to attach his khilafah, or his dynasty to the past. Right. So and also in these gatherings, especially during the Umayyad, the Majalis is from the time of Muawiyah onwards, because people attending the Majalis often were paid, and if they were scholars, if they were poets, they were rewarded for their attendance. And so people, you begin to see people, even imposters, attending, even if they were famous poets, some even plagiarists, people who stole other people's poems, attending gatherings and reciting. One famous story you will find mentioned in Al-Kamil fi Lugha is that the grammarian Al-Mubarrad recorded this in his Al-Kamil, and he says that Abdullah ibn Zubayr was once caught during one of Muawiyah's Majalis plagiarizing verses from a poem by the Mukhadram poet Ma'an bin Aus of Banu Muzayna. And according to the narrator of the tradition, Abdullah bin Zubayr offered to recite a poem in which he inserted verses from a poem by Ma'an bin Aus, after which Muawiyah was so impressed, and aware, of course, that this was plagiarism, and he praised him and said, you have excelled as a poet. Sha'urta ba'dan. You have excelled as a poet. And unfortunately, Ma'an bin Aus soon arrived in the same majlis, and was asked by Muawiyah to recite a poem, and he went on to recite his famous poem La Amruka, until he reached the exact verses which had been plagiarized by Abdullah ibn Zubayr. A surprised Muawiyah turned to Abdullah bin Zubayr and asked, did you not just tell us that this was your poem and these were your own, you're the originator of this, where you composed this. To which Abdullah ibn Zubayr responded, and he said, I improved the meaning of the poem and he composed the poem. Right. So, and then he went on to defend himself, saying that he is my milk brother. They were both breastfed by the same woman, and he wasn't lying. And then he says, so because he's my milk brother, what belongs to him belongs to me too. Right. So that's how we try to get out of this tricky situation. So these sort of things happened in this. So in the early Abbasid era, the Majālis continued to. In fact, it was in the in the Abbasid period that the Majālis now became this multi-disciplinary and spaces of knowledge, and the works, some of the works which came out of it are the works like the Mufaddaliyat, for example, of Al-Mufaddal Adab, came out of the Majlis. And I will not discuss the Mufaddal at the moment, but if questions come up, I will refer to it. And the Abbasid intellectual Majālis in cities like Baghdad, and in particular in Baghdad, attracted the most eminent scholars and the best and brightest students from different parts of the then Muslim world, especially from Khurasan, which, as you know, had acquired the reputation as a superpower in the study of hadith and fiqh, the kind of intellectual superpower. So Abbasid caliphs actively encouraged scholars from Khurasan to come and resettle in Baghdad. In the same way that today you find colleges and universities trying to recruit, from various countries, but that you want, with Brexit, I don't know what will happen, right? So the Abbāsid were very passionate about that. They spent a lot of money early Abbāsid trying to recruit, and this is in the early stages of the establishment of Baghdad. It was established by Al-Mansur, as you know. It is in the early stages of the establishment of Baghdad. So he wants this new city to also become a center of learning. And the way he was going to do it, was to get all the best scholars he could from places like Khurasan. So, and Al-Mansur he issued a decree in order to attract these scholars. He issued a decree. First, they would be given a lot of money, and they would be allowed to open their Majālis and do whatever they wanted. And the Jami Al-Mansur was there for them, the mosque. They could do whatever they wanted inside. They had total freedom to do what they wanted. And he also issued a decree that the streets of Baghdad would be renamed after the most eminent scholar who lived there. So if you're a great scholar in fiqh, you lived on a particular street, that street would be renamed after you. So scholars, hadith scholars and jurists such as Khuzaymah bin Khazin and Abu Ishaq, Ibrahim bin Ahmad, who arrived from Khurasan to teach hadith and fiqh, had streets named after them. And I don't know what is the situation today in Iraq, but I hope that some of that heritage has been preserved. We had the years under Saddam and then the war, and we know that he also tried to erase some of the traces from the past and the war, and we don't know what the situation is today, but we hope that some of that at least has been preserved. So by the year 810 of the Common Era, there were about 50 Majālis on a wide range of subjects taking place daily at the same time in the Jami al-Mansur. Right. So there were about 50 Majālis happening at the same time. So among the scholars who arrived in Baghdad from Khurasan, we had and established their own Majālis, were the masters of Quranic hermeneutics and Qira'ah, Ahmad bin Jibreen, and you also had Abu Yahya al-Khafaf, who, according to Khatib al-Baghdadi, was among the earliest scholars to compile a work on tafsir. And the Mu'tazilite theologian Abdullah bin Ahmad Mahmud also arrived in Baghdad, and who's better known as Al-Ka'bi, and who became a key intellectual figure in Mu'tazilite circles in Baghdad. And his Majālis were considered the most prestigious to attend during that time. And you also had the philosopher Ibn Tayyib as-Sarakhsi, and who was a student of Al-Kindi, and also who became the chief confidant and advisor to the Khalifa al-Mu'tadid Billah, and also the hadith scholars Imam al-Bukhari, who was described by Ahmad bin Hanbal as the best scholar to ever come out of Khurasan. He also arrived in Baghdad. And also we had Imam at-Tirmidhi, the student of al-Bukhari, and also we had an-Nasa'i, and Imam Muslim, the grammarian al-Farisi, Abu Ali al-Farisi, who arrived in Baghdad around the year 910 CE and established himself as a master grammarian. And also Sulaiman bin Ma'bad al-Mirwazi, who attended the Majālis of Al-Asma'i, the compiler of the Asma'iyat. And then we had a lot of udaba, like Abu Ishaq as-Suli, whom the poet al-Buhtari named the writer of Iraq. Although he was from Khurasan, he became the writer of Iraq. And Abdullah bin Hani, and who was described by Imam Jalaluddin Suyuti as the master of Gharib al-Alfaz. So all these scholars and many others, the list is too long to mention, all arrived in Baghdad. So the Majālis really were multi-disciplinary and interdisciplinary. You had all these scholars attending at the same time. Now, because my time is almost up, I'll just go through some of the samples from the some of the texts you find in Majālis literature. I start with one, which is the Majlis between Muhammad bin Sulaiman al-Hashimi and al-Akhfash. So it is reported that Al-Mazini records, and he says that Muhammad bin Sulaiman, who was the Amir of Basra, was reciting the Quran, and he came to the part in the Quran, Inna Allaha wa malaikatahu yusalluna ala nabi, and he read Inna Allaha wa malaikatuhu, right? So we know there is inna, so there is waw atf, so we expect it to be wa malaikatahu, right? But he read with a dhamma, and he was embarrassed, and he didn't want to change. He didn't want people to know that he had made this mistake. So he decided, okay, according to the narrator, he sent for the grammarians, but the Basra grammarians. They said, I have a problem. Get me out of this sticky situation. And he said to them, ihtaluli, find me a healer. Maybe they were Hanafi grammarians, I don't know. So no, I can say that I'm a Hanafi, right? Well, so he said, find me a way out of this sticky situation. So then they told him, okay, forget about the inna, then you can explain that your atf is on Allah, which is in the state of rafa, so you are justified in reading wa malaikatu. So according to the tradition, walam tazal qira'atahu hatta mata, and this continued to be his qira'ah until he died. Now we have to ask ourselves, how many of these situations happened? And also some of the views we now read in the edited volumes. How sure are we that those positions were because the scholar, especially the shadh, the kind of masail shadh, was because the scholar was embarrassed to change his position in a majlis and then stuck to it, and we think of it as the position of the scholar, right? So there are numerous examples like this you'll find when you start reading this majalis, where someone couldn't change their position, especially in the field of qira'ah. Let's see if we can find another one here. Right. Right. This one is from Abu Hatim as-Sijistani, who says that I used to study under Ya'qub, the Qari, and I had how the classes happened is I would wait while someone is reciting, and then when that person stops, and I would carry on from wherever the person has stopped to So on this occasion, the person was reading from Surah Al-Baqarah, and he reached to the part وَقَالَ لَهُمْ نَبِيُّهُمْ, and then I carried on from there until I reached the part فَلَمَّا جَاوَزَ هُوَ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مَعَهُ, right? And when I read there, Yaqub stopped me. He said, no, read again, read correctly. And I read again min ghayr idgham, without idgham, right? I read it, that part again without idgham. And yet I had been reading this part to him with idgham, bil idgham miraran. Right? And it says I had been reading this miraran kathira. I had been reading this part with idgham many times, and on this occasion, for some reason, he wanted me to read it differently. And then I said to him, this is not how you read it. And he said, why do you say this? Right? And then فَقَالَ لِمَا, and he said, why? He said, why do you say this? And then he goes on, now the teacher goes on to quote a tradition to support his reading. Although his new reading is different from what he had been teaching the student. And then he goes on to cite a tradition. And then فَقُلْتُ لَهُ, and then he says, I said to my teacher, I think this tradition is not reliable. And I think these scholars, however great they are, I think they made a mistake. They didn't record it correctly. And then he finished his reading and left. And he says, while I was leaving, Al-Akhfash was sitting, Al-Akhfash, the grammarian, was always seated behind the Qari. And then he came to me, I came to pay my respect to him, and he said to me, may God's curse be upon you. You're coming in this gathering to teach your teachers instead of listening to your teachers. Right. And then the grammarian goes on to say that I have heard your teacher, after you had this conversation with him, I have heard him changing his recitation to conform to yours. Right? Although he had insisted that the reading was wrong, but for some reason he realized that maybe this reading was. So the question now you have to ask yourself, he cited a tradition to support his position, and the student is disagreeing with that tradition on a qira'ah, right? And then he goes back to the position of the student as being according to him, the established reading of. So how many of these cases do we have? In other subjects, not just qira'ah or grammar, in other disciplines as well. And this is where the majalis become very important, because this information will not enter in a textbook on qira'ah. You won't find this there. You'll find it often in the majalis literature. I don't know how many minutes I have. If I have 3 minutes. Okay, well, maybe 1 or 2 more examples. And we also have, there are many of these qira'ah examples, but the other example I would like to discuss is of Al-Farazdaq. We know that Al-Farazdaq was a great poet, right? And yet, and often what we have studied is that it works like this. If you are stuck, you go to the poets. That's where you go, and if you're stuck in grammar, you go and look at what the poets said, and if you're stuck in tafsir, you want a meaning, you go to the poets. But in this particular example, Al-Farazdaq goes to the grammarian to try and find out the correct way of reading a verse from the poem by the Rumma, because he can't make out what is the correct way of reading it. So he's relying on the grammarian Ibn Abi Ishaq, who's described as one of the earliest writers in the field of grammar. So Al-Farazdaq here goes to the grammarian. So that's why we can describe the majalis as centers of learning which were characterized by the cross-pollination of ideas. It wasn't just as we often think of, that everyone was going to the poets. Also the poets were going to the scholars and the grammarians to try and verify their own readings of especially information from the past. Why is this important? Because these poems were transmitted orally before they were written down from the pre-Islamic period onwards. So, and often the Ruwat improvised and even changed some of the words in the poem, depending on the majlis. And by the time they are reaching people like Al-Farazdaq and others, even in the Abbāsid period, there's no way of telling which is the correct way of reading certain words in a poem. It was here you find the ulama in grammar, the ulama in language becoming more dominant and more influential than the Rawi. So here you now have a shift. In the Umayyad, it was the Rawi and the poet who occupied a privileged position as transmitters of knowledge, even in the field of hadith. But it is in the Abbāsid period now you start having the fuqaha. You know, people say, well, they often think that the faqih and the muhaddith, that is the muhaddithin were somehow superior, or the faqih were. You can't make that distinction because there were many cases in which the muhaddithin relied on the fuqaha in order to somehow explain some of the hadith. So the Ruwat up to the second half of the first century, the Ruwat had a dominant position in the transmission of hadith and the transmission of poetry. And then with the establishment of Majālis and Abbāsid, you begin to see the alim becoming more prominent because they are now authenticating some of the riwayat from the. So I will stop here, and we open for there's a lot to discuss, but I'm sure we can cover some of these topics in the in the session. Yes.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Barakallahu feekum.
So we will now open up the floor for questions and or discussions. So if anyone wants to ask a question related to the topic, or raise a point or a comment. Okay, do think of these, and it's a good idea to be thinking of them as you go. What I do is I always formulate a few questions as I take notes, especially when I'm here. So I've got a couple of questions for you, Michael. So you mentioned the Majālis literature, and obviously you discussed a broad range of literature. But when we're talking about particularly the Umayyad and the Abbāsid Majālis literature, my question is when were these sources collected? For us to access them, we have to have written records. So when were they written down, if they were oral, or were notes taken in the classes? Was it later isnad based, sort of that process? Who was doing this collection? And also, has it been published? Is it available now? Has it been published form? Is it still in manuscript? How much is in manuscript? This kind of question.
Excellent question. It's an important question, which it's on the section I omitted in order to save time. The Majālis literature are from the 9th and 10th century. The ones I've used are from the 9th, 10th century. Yeah. Right. And as you know, this is the period when the book culture develops in Islam. Right, and in other words, they are eyewitness accounts of what is happening. In some cases, you only have got 2 people in the sanad or 3 people in the sanad, and in many cases, people are reporting the events they saw. And where you have a longer sanad, it's because someone in the majlis has quoted a sanad, to a period before the notes exist, the printed, or rather the written material exists. So they are happening at the time when this stuff is going on, and that's why they are important, and that's why I describe them as a place where you look at the ingredients that goes into the development. Yes, they have been published and edited, and that's the good news. The Majālis Adab, Majālis Ulama, they are all now available in print and also available online. You get volumes of them online, yes. And there are 2 types of literature, I would say 4, but there's 2 main types of literature which come out of Majālis. So you've got the Majālis literature, although some scholars argue that there is no difference, but there is a difference, a technical difference. So Majālis literature is the report of what is going on in the gathering. So it includes the discussion as well as everything else around, who was wearing what and so forth, including the gossip. Right. So, the places where they sat was also important. Some of them were formal majalis, especially those which happened in the royal court. You had to dress a certain way before going there, so that information is there. You had to sit in a certain way. You had to address in a certain way. So there were formal majalis, and the majalis which happened in the royal court. They served a number of functions: political prestige for the Khalifa, to demonstrate that he's surrounded by brilliant minds, and also as recruiting ground for teachers for the children of the Khalifa, because many of these Khulafa were scholars. They studied, especially in the Abbāsid period. They were passionate about knowledge. So the Majalis was the place where scholars demonstrated that they were qualified to educate the children of the Khalifa. And so there were ways in which this happened. So the Majalis literature is a document of what happened in the Majlis. Then you have got Al-Amali, which also comes out of Majalis, but these were dictated notes by the teacher. So the teacher is dictating to the student. So in the Amali, the titles or works we find Amali or Fulan, you don't get the details, some of the other details you get in the Majalis. So you just get the knowledge, the notes from the teacher. Or the teacher is dictating, or in some cases the students go and read in front of the teacher. It is still Amali, because Imla, from Imla, dictation. So that these are the two types of literature that come out of Majalis. And then these notes, including the notes in the Majalis, in the Amali, they go on to inform the writings that are produced later on. In some cases, the people sitting in the Majlis are taking their own notes. They choose what to include in their collections or what to exclude. I don't know if I've answered.
Did the caliphs, Abbāsid caliphs, have their own official scribes, as I was talking about sometimes?
Yes, they had. They had their... when they had you mean when they had their own...
in their royal gatherings, did they have like an official scribe who would take the notes, or was it more just done, just people who happened to be there just took it? We know that they had their own scribes, but some of the material was lost. The Mongols, when the Mongols attacked, and because the libraries, the targeted libraries were the libraries of the ruling elites, so we were left with the material of scholars and ordinary people. So they had the official libraries were destroyed. A lot of them were destroyed. So yes, those documents existed, and some have survived in other writings here and there. Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know.
So I'm guessing. I think kind of like related to Dr. Harvey's question. These types of reports. I mean. Because I've come across books of Amali, but I've never come across a book that's entitled Majālis Kada. So are they preserved in like books like Ibn Sa'ad or biographical dictionaries, or are they actually? Is there actually a genre of books called Majālis Kada that you?
Yes, there is, and this is part of the problem, that it is a literature that we have neglected. It is a body of literature called Majālis with the title Majālis on the cover. Right, so it is the most neglected area of study, and yet it has, we find a lot of fascinating things there. On Qira'ah, whatever your interest, theology, grammar, whatever you are interested in, you find the material there. So you'll find some of the material you won't find in the books with the title, maybe a book on fiqh or grammar, you won't find them. And also, even some of the grammatical positions, we know there were different schools of grammar. The Basra, the Kufa, we don't know whether those were real, legitimate grammatical theories, or people were just too embarrassed to admit they got it wrong, right? So you have all these strange grammatical theories. They exist as part of the madhahib, and we don't know, when we read the textbooks on grammar, we don't know whether these were just, whether these are legitimate grammatical theories or people too embarrassed to say, well, we got it wrong because it's happening in a majlis. But you get that in the majlis. So when you read in the majlis, you find that in some cases, people are reporting that he was too embarrassed to admit that he got it wrong, like the Amir of Basra. In the other tradition of the same version, by a grammarian. He said, I went to his house, I informed him that your recitation was wrong, and then he paid me with a camel and some money and said, okay, keep quiet about this. And then the following day, he called the grammarians and they had a meeting, and then boom, they had a new qira'ah, right? So you really don't know. Well, that information is there in the majlis, right? So we may dismiss it, but we have to ask. Often it's important to read on the margins, to read the material that often is excluded. What we tend to do is to read in the center. And it is in the margins that we find things that are so important. Reading from the margins to the center is, I think, the approach that will open a lot of things for us. So yes, the literature exists. You just title, for example, Majālis Ulama, Majālis Udaba, you find volumes under those titles, yes. And many of them from the 9th century onwards.
Yeah, question here.
Yeah. So didn't the Kufans or the so-called Kufans refute grammatical justifications?
Did they not?
Didn't they oppose grammatical justifications of the different recitations?
Oppose grammatical justifications for
I think
recitation?
he's talking about the descriptive approach versus the more theoretical approach to grammar.
Right. Well, yes. There were grammarians who opposed any kind of grammatical justification, but we also know when you read Majalis that a lot of the recitations you will see there were being justified by grammarians on the basis of grammar. So the question we have to ask is that how was some of the information left out from the official corpus of what we have inherited on a particular discipline, right? So what was included and what was excluded, and what were the mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion? So those are the questions that we may have to ask. I studied Qira'ah. I'm not a Qari, I'm not a specialist in Qira'ah. I studied Qira'ah in the same way that everybody has done. If you go through the Nizami system, you do it in tafsir, you do it in your reading of Jalalain, you do it, but you are not a specialist in the field, right? You know all about the sarf and even the grammatical, some of the grammatical justification, some of the reading, where you, Jaru Jiwar, for example, and those theories do exist. You see them in Al-Jar. It is an area where someone who has studied Qira'ah as a subject, not just as part of a module, but who has actually specialized in. And I think this is an area where they need to look at by reading some of the Majalis literature and see what can they find in there. But there's a lot, I can tell you that. Just try it today. Majālis Ulama is a good example. Opening, it's one volume, so you can read the whole thing in one day. And look at the examples you find. You'll be amazed at some of the discussions that are happening there. And you wonder how come this information didn't make it here.
Sister here had a question then.
Okay. Very much thank you for your very quick question. How do you make it possible to have the culture of Majalis today, especially in the Muslim world, given that we are using a modern educational system, which often puts us to only specialize in one particular area? For example, I'm studying law, therefore I'm just good enough. I won't be able to be good in other areas. Thank you.
Yeah. This is an ancient question. Specializing, and there was a huge debate. Al-Mawardi wrote on it, Al-Jahid wrote on it, Al-Ghazali discussed it. Takhasus, its role in the development of a scholar, right? So there is a huge debate, and there was an understanding. You could summarize. You could say that the view was that, well, being too specialized in one field was not a good thing. So you wanted to have access to all the ulum, and then you go on and specialize. That was the approach. That's what you see in all the writers, Al-Jahid, Al-Mawardi, and many others from the Middle Ages, and Suyuti even. They discussed, this question came up, that you need, and the kind of liberal arts education you find in Islamic traditional centers like Darul Ulums, Islamic universities, Ebrahim College, even where you study, you're exposed to a wide range of subjects from different teachers. That diversity we're talking about, it's not just diversity in the teachers, but diversity in the subjects. Like we saw in Jamia Mansour, there were 50 majalis happening at the same time under the same roof, in the same space. So that is how these scholars were developing. And then they choose to go on and specialize. Now, someone who comes out of this education, they know about tafsir, they know about qira'ah. I know about qira'ah, but I'm not a qari. I'm not a specialist in the field. I can have a conversation on it. I can teach at a basic level, but I'm not authorized to consider myself a qari. Right? So you study a wide range, then you go on and specialize in what, where your heart takes you and where your knowledge takes you. So that's what was happening. Now, today, and I think that tradition has to be maintained. And the secular university model you're talking about, I think it's just in the UK where you see this type of specialization. In America, you have the liberal arts college system, where you go to university, to college, you are taught a wide range of subjects, and then you go to graduate school where you specialize and so forth and so on. It's very similar to what you could call the ancient Muslim model of education, right? So where you had to study this. And this is a type of a majlis in a way, although we are discussing one topic, but I understand that these majalis take place regularly, where scholars in different fields are invited, they come and talk on a subject. So this is a continuation of that tradition, where students are exposed to a wide range of subjects, even some of the things they may not cover in the classroom because of the constraints of the curriculum. You have to do certain things and for the purpose of exam, but in this kind of spaces you have an opportunity to explore other areas. It's just that they don't happen everywhere. I mean, I went to a Darul Uloom system. We didn't have seminars, right? So we had scholars invited who came to speak and teach, but we didn't have this kind of seminar. So this is important. So it means we lost that tradition of having, although we were exposed to a wide range of approaches in the classroom, but I think it's also important to have spaces like this where people can have these kinds of discussions.
How do you verify the authenticity of this Majālis literature? In other words, do we just take it on face value?
No, we don't. No, we don't take it on face value. The document, first you have the works have been edited and authenticated, and they are there and published as scholarly editions have been produced of the works. That part has been done. Now, what about the material inside? The material inside, because we find it scattered in other works here and there. So what you see, yes. So what you see in a good edited version, in the footnote, the editors will tell you that yes, you can also find this in this work here, find it here, and find it there. Often they will appear as marginal notes in some of the works of the early writers. So you find that mentioned in there. So yes, the material in there is just like the material found in any other work, Ulum al-Quran, because what you have in Ulum al-Quran are the refined final product. What you find in the Majālis is what is going on before this material has been refined, and they come with a sanad. Each, when you go and check the Majālis, wallahi, all the ones I'm talking about, check today. Start with Majālis al-Ulama, which is there, and each one has a sanad. So you can check and verify the sanad, and they all have sanad. I haven't seen one which doesn't. So they come Majlis 1, Majlis 2, Majlis 3, each one with a sanad, complete sanad. So, and in some cases, there are majahil in there where ikhwanuna, akhbarana ikhwanuna, things like our brothers told us, and then you can ask yourself whether you want to accept that tradition or not. If the ruwat are not mentioned, and also if you know some of the ruwat, maybe some are not credible ruwat. So they have the chain of transmission.
It's really popular amongst the linguists that you only take the poetry of the Jāhilīyah and then the Islamiyya and then the Umayyad as Hujjah as evidence. And all after that, there was a, if you're saying that it's got chain of transmission all the way, how come they put a stop to it then?
They put a stop to...
After they're saying, like, if you want to quote any poet's words as an example, you have to quote the Jāhilīyah or the Umayyun or that's it, After that, they don't take Abbāsiyun and, those who came after them.
There is an example in the Majlis where a Qari recited a certain qira'ah and then was asked for justification and cited a poem for it. It is there in fact, I think I have the notes here. So things like that happened, and often it was the early ancient poems they cited. So I don't know if I understood your question. You're asking if they have chains of transmission going back.
I'm saying, the linguists, they agree that if you want to quote anyone's poetry as evidence to prove that this is correct in the concept of grammar or sarf or anything, they say you have to only quote the words of those poets who came very early, like the Jāhilīyah ones, or those who came up to Umayyad. And after Umayyad, they put a stop to it.
Yes.
So is there a reason for that? Because if you have chain of transmission, then there is no need to put a stop to that.
Yeah, I get your point. Now, the chain of transmission is to transmit the matan, is to transmit the poem, right? So I hope I understood your question.
Yeah.
So it is to transmit the poem. So the poem is still the ancient poem. It just has been transmitted through the ruwat, right? But the reason why they also said that is because, and first of all, we have to ask ourselves who said this, when was it said?
Yeah.
It is said in the Abbāsid period.
That's right.
Right. So we don't have anyone before that saying this theory that you can only use that poetry. And the reason I think this happened is also is because the Mufaddal Adhabi, if you read the reasons why it was compiled because it documented the obscure poetry, the poetry that was gharib. And why was this considered to be important? Because it was deemed to be unadulterated by the Ibnization and everything. So it was deemed to contain the essence of the language of the Jahiliyyah. Right. So because the earliest work of poetry we have ever in compilation is the Mufaddaliyat, and because this whole work is about gharib, that's why I think it became the most important source for scholars. And scholars now would refer to it, and we know that the study of gharib al-alfaz became an important discipline in itself. So works like that became important. And I think that's where the theory now developed, because you now have the only available textbook the textbook, because it is also a taught textbook. Now, it is a section I said I will not read on Mufaddaliyat. It is prepared to be taught in a classroom. That's why it was prepared. It was prepared to be taught, because the only available textbook dealt with the gharib. Maybe, I'm not saying this is the reason, I'm thinking that maybe the theory developed that you could only use the material. And part of it also because when it comes to, I think this is the reason actually. I do mention that. Let me just look quickly at that page and I'll explain that part. So here's the part. So the compilation of the Mufaddaliyat marked the beginning of the process of monumentalizing the Jahiliyyah, documenting the past. It played a significant role in constructing the past. But the part, according to Jawad Ali, the eminent philologist, Al-Mufaddal was created, came out of lecture notes, and Mufaddal did not produce his collection as a fixed book. He selected prepared parts whenever he could, and dictated the material to his student Al-Mahdi, the prince, until he completed presenting everything he had collected. Right, and in his study, so I'm looking for the part on the Sha'r
I believe, if I can interject,
yes.
I believe wasn't CIRE Ibn Ishaq also written for Al-Mahdi, I believe it's called. So it's interesting the kind of compilation and editing of materials to be sort of presented
Yes.
to like the princes of the early Abbāsids.
As a textbook,
become
yes.
the textbooks,
Mm.
and these become like key sources for the ulum going forward.
Yes.
And then you get in the political debates. We were having this discussion yesterday about, well, if Ibn Asakir is presenting for the Abbāsids, will he
Yes.
include
material?
Or exclude material that would, for example, exclude material that would favour Banu Umayyah in the CIRE or something? This debate comes in as well.
Yeah. I think because most of the Abbāsid scholars relied on patronage from the ruling elite. So that, the example I mentioned of the Amir of Basra who's hiring grammarians to find a solution, it's like you funded the research where you have to produce results suitable to the demand of the state.
Not too much different from today.
Exactly. So this started long ago. And we also know of Harun Rashid with some of his judges, how they changed the masail in order to accommodate his political vision. So this was quite common. Those scholars who were attached to the establishment often produced results that would fit the needs of the establishment. And then you had other scholars who were on the margins, or were either seen as rebels. Some of them were imprisoned, tortured, and all sorts of things happened. Yes. I don't know if I've answered your question. Yeah, because
let's move on to the time. We've got Maulana Ashraf and then Uwais as well.
I just wanted to ask, is there any practical implication of knowing all of that?
Good question. Good question. Yeah, right. So, it's a very good question. And you see, there are two traditions when it comes to knowledge. So you have the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, and then you have the pursuit of knowledge because there should be practical outcome as a result of that. And these are two opposing philosophical philosophies of education. And we see even in the UK that different universities operate exactly like that. So if you look at the more ancient universities, there's the idea that you pursue knowledge for its own sake, and if there are practical outcomes, that's fine. And then the new universities, it has to to show something. So when you submit a proposal for research, you have to show what will be the practical application of this knowledge, right? So for me, I think the practical, what I get from it is that this Majālis, the participants in this Majālis were not passive transmitters of knowledge. They were not just sitting there and transmitting the knowledge from their teachers and then passing it on. They were actively involved in challenging some of the views presented to them. And as a result of that dialogue and discussion among scholars, students, and teachers, you had knowledge. We now live in a situation where students are passive transmitters, even teachers are passive transmitters of the tradition of the past. And we think that our role as scholars is like that of curators in a museum. We're simply curating the past and passing it on. We're not giving life or new life to knowledge. And this is what we see being the key difference between how we approach material and what was happening in the Majālis. So in the Majālis, you see people are actively involved. They are looking at ideas. They are accepting some ideas, challenging some ideas, and as a result, you have different forms of knowledge developed out of that. And maybe this can encourage us to not just to hold Majālis, but also to encourage the culture of what happened in the Majālis in the past. There are two ways you can continue to have Majālis. There are so many of them going on even as we speak in this country, where people just go, sit, transmit knowledge. They see themselves simply as a chain in a long chain of transmitters of knowledge. But the scholars of the past, starting from that generation of the Majālis onwards, look at the students of Abu Hanifa. The two of them didn't even agree with each other, right? And some of them went on to transform completely the teachings of their teacher. Right, so that is what you see happening in the Majlis, that even students are, revising some of the knowledge they've inherited from the past, and then when it reaches us, it has been transformed in many ways to fit in different contexts. And I think that's the best thing for me that I learned from this literature when I study, that I see that I don't have to feel guilty when I ask certain questions, because I say I'm not the first to ask this question. As one of my professors say, Montgomery would say, there's nothing new under the sun. And often we think that we come up with new ideas today. But if you study this literature, you see that some of the things we think of as original new ideas we've invented were discussed long ago, centuries ago, by the scholars.
Thank you. And Uwais?
Okay, inshallah, it's just a comment. Jazakallah khairan for
Barakallahu
the
fikum.
There's a comment that you made regarding, a remark regarding the Jāhilī moral code and how you said that Islam came and upheld Jāhilī behavior except revenge.
Yes.
There's a question I had regarding my own readings of the Jāhilī period. It's particularly to do with Antara, since Antara was perhaps the only one who had African or black heritage. He discusses the issue of racism. So the issue that comes up in his poetry time and time again is the fact that he's of dark skin, he's not necessarily from the aristocracy or from good stock, so as to say, but then he wins his way back through his character, through his chivalry, through the fact that he's also warrior and so on. So like there's this idea that like the Prophet ﷺ associates, if the riwayah is correct, racial discrimination as something that is part and parcel of the Jahiliyyah. So where he says, إِنَّكَ مَرْءٌ فِيكَ جَاهِلِيَّةٌ if I'm not mistaken. So, so are we going to then say that when the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّكَ لَا تَفْضَلْ الْأَسْوَدْ وَالْأَحْمَرْ إِلَّا أَن تَفْضَلَ بِالتَّقْوَى, do you think that he's upholding Antara's message over here? Because Antara's message is no different in his poetry, where he says that it's not about color, but it's about one's deeds, one's activities.
Yes.
So is that how we're going to now reread it? So where you said that the Jahili came, that Islam upheld the Jahili practices, so are we saying that the Prophet is upholding Antara's version of Jahiliyyah, like his, or is it
or the dominant group? So yes, it's an important question.
Is it very dominant? Like that's the question. Because Antara discusses it, but apart from him, I don't really. Well, I haven't come across Jāhilī poetry apart from him addressing it.
Yes. Antara is the most famous, but not the only one who was black from the Jāhilī period. He's the most famous, and also the most famous because his poetry was preserved. But also, he features in the Mu'allaka, as one of the great poets from the pre-Islamic period. But in the Tabaqat of the Shu'ara, and he's placed in category 6. Now, the Al-Ambari explained that the reason he places him there is not because he doesn't qualify to be in the first category, but because he was let down. People like him were let down by the Ruwat, because the poet was also the poet of the tribe. So if you were an outsider, so it means the Ruwat would often not think it worthy to preserve your knowledge. Right. So because the Ruwat, the narrators, didn't narrate his poem, only the Mu'allaka and other poems survived. But because the Tabaqat was arranged according to quantity and quality as well. So if you had quality only and not quantity, your rank, like Antara and others. And he himself says that in some of his poem, when he's talking about, he says, my people, when it is when they are in peace, they call me racist names, but when it is time of war, they say, oh, you son of noble ones, and so forth and so on, right? So even he mentions that, and that is what happens even in our societies today. Now, the racism did exist in Jāhilī period. It existed in the time of the Prophet. We know the stories of what happened between Bilal and Abu Dharr al-Ghifari, and many other examples. The very fact that we have the Prophet telling people that you should obey a leader, even though the leader may be an Abyssinian slave with thick hair, the very fact that he says these things, it tells us that something was going on. Otherwise, there's no point in mentioning that the woman who was given glad tidings of paradise was a black woman, or that, you have to, if racism is not existing, there's no need for it. So the fact that we have these ahadith show us that something was going on and the Prophet was trying to fight that. So this is one aspect of Jahiliyyah that you could say. When I was talking about what Islam preserved, we say the moral and ethical teachings of the past, and racism and all that. There's nothing moral or ethical about it, right? So I was talking about the moral and ethical things that they regarded in Jahiliyyah as moral and ethical teaching. But even in Jahiliyyah, they regarded racism as a bad thing, although they did it, right? So people like Antara is from the Jahiliyyah. He is writing, composing his poems in Arabic, and he's attacking it. And this is why it's important to read the past from the margins. Because if we don't read the past from the margins, we privilege the dominant voices. And when we privilege the dominant voices, we start making statements like, we can't judge the past by the standards of the present. When we say that, we are assuming that no one in the past questioned these things, right? So we are assuming that no one in the past said this was wrong, when yet so many people say they were wrong. And even in the Abbāsid period, the Shu'ubi...
I was going to come to that. If we're saying that the Umayyads were patrons in trying to re-establish this Jahili order, do you think that with the Shu'ubiyya that then came about with the Da'wah Abbasiyya, the amount, like the surge in and the influx in, pan-Persian literature, or saying that the Persians are better than the Arabs, and then all these discussions, do you think that was part and parcel of this discussion?
Of the discussion in the Abbāsid?
Racism. So if we're saying that if the Umayyads were trying to revive certain elements of the Jahili, of the pre-Islamic code, that included racism of some sort.
Okay, all right. I get your point. The Umayyads were fascinated by the poetry and all the other ethical teachings I mentioned, Muru'ah, Hamasa, and so forth. Now, there were other political problems we know associated with the Umayyad dynasty, Arabocentrism, the privileging of someone purely because they are Arab, regardless of whether the person is Muslim or not. And if you're Muslim but you're not Arab, you occupy the third or second class position. That is another problem that had nothing to do with the Jahiliyyah. It is something that developed in how the Umayyad administered, and part of the reason why you had a rebellion of the Abbāsids and so forth. But in the Abbāsid, although the Abbāsid came in on promise that they would wipe out all these things, we know that with the influx of people from Khurasan and a lot of people from East Africa, in Tabari, the Zanji rebellion, and of course other people already lived there. Al-Jahid, his grandfather, lived there, although originally from East Africa. So you had the development of the emergence of the Shu'ubi movement, made up mostly of Persians and others, including East Africans. So, and now from their point of view, the Persians argue that they were responding to Arab racism. That's what they say. But the problem we have is that all our knowledge about the Shu'ubiyyah come to us from their critics. So we have everything we know about the Shu'ubiyyah comes from Al-Jahid, come from Ibn Qutayba, who were the most and the fiercest critics of the Shu'ubi movement. Right. So we don't have the direct, what you might call, material in Arabic by this group. Maybe Ibn Marzuban, some of his works, the satire he writes, he could be, representing that voice, but then the style he writes, you don't know whether he's joking or, So it's a bit of a problem. But we don't have everything. So we only have to take Al-Jahid's word and Ibn Qutayba's word. So although Al-Jahid is often loyal, rather very honest in how he presents some of these views, so we know most of it from Kitab al-Bayan, in the section Kitab al-Asa. That chapter deals with the Shu'ubiyyah. Everything they were saying is there. Yes, it is true that they were mocking and insulting Arab culture and Arab, the use of the Asa, the language and everything. And from Al-Jahid's point of view, some of these views were kufr. because you're mocking the Prophet, you're mocking the Quran, and so forth and so on. So yes, this was happening. So who was being racist? That's the problem. So the Shu'ubi will say we were responding to racism, but when you look at what some of the things they were saying, yes, they were offensive. An Arab would be offended by it.
We're going to have to formally close. We've got over time.
Yes, okay.
We can carry on, inshallah.
Yes.
Jazakallah khairan for everyone coming, especially